If you have had the opportunity to read the Bible, you have surely come across the book of Enoch. I want to point out that, at least in part, the author of the Epistle of Jude, present in the New Testament, refers to a passage from the book of Enoch, and this quotation is made literally. In addition, it is important to note that several other Christian writers, who have an origin linked to Alexandria, as well as St. Augustine, also mention and comment on the content of the book of Enoch. But, after all, what is this much commented book in fact? The message is not clear and does not provide enough information for me to understand or elaborate an appropriate response. Could you provide more context or details about what you'd like me to say? This would help me offer a more accurate and relevant answer. Despite having exerted a significant and striking influence throughout antiquity, this figure is practically unknown today. Its importance in the formation of cultures and ideas of that time is undeniable. However, the lack of contemporary recognition is remarkable and, in a way, surprising. Nowadays, the idea of this video is to present an overview of the Book of Enoch, going through each of the books of Suli contained in it and situating these texts historically. If this interests you, then you are very welcome. Take some water and coffee and find a comfortable position, as this topic will require some time and also a lot of attention. So first of all, it's important to say that there are 3 books called the Book of Enoch. The oldest of them all is often called simply the Book of Enoch, which is what I'll also be doing throughout this video. But that same book is also often called First Enoch, or Ethiopian Enoch. In addition to him, we also have the Second Enoch or Slavic Enoch and the Third Enoch or Hebrew Enoch. But despite these titles, First, Second and Third Enoch, these texts are very different and very distant in time and do not form a sequence. It is not as if it were. For example, The Godfather 1, 2, and 3, each of them is an independent work that circulated separately throughout history and something else. The First Enoch itself is not a single text. In fact, this very long work with more than 100 chapters in total is usually divided into 5 smaller books: the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Book of Luminaries, the Book of Dreams, and the Epistle of Enoch, as well as 2 very short ones. At the end of this video, I will focus specifically on the First Enoch and these Suli books that make it up, and in a little while we will take a look at each of them, seeing what each of these parts says. But first, it is worth talking a little about the date and context of this First Enoch. According to the text itself, the author of the book would be the patriarch Enoch, father of Methuselah and great-grandfather of Noah, who is mentioned in passing in the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis relates a passage that mentions Enoch, stating that he lived in close communion with God. At one point, Enoch simply disappeared, because God took him with him. In this way, this unique and exceptional connection that Enoch established with the Lord, along with his rapture, provides the necessary context for understanding the various visions and journeys involving heaven and even hell, all of which are presented in the scriptures of the book of Enoch. Certainly, when we look at the issue from a historical perspective, it is evident that the attribution of this authorship is not recognized or accepted. The book of Enoch contains a number of prophetic visions that coincide very closely, as well as with the events of the period of Hellenistic Greek domination there in the region of Judea, and also with the events of the Maccabean period, which indicates that the author knew about these events that were passed on to him, even placing these events as predictions of the future made by Enoch. Well, if you start from the premise that it is really possible for someone to have access to the future, this dating argument may not be very convincing. But the fact is that historically, academically, if we have a text that talks about Napoleon, for example, we treat it as after Napoleon, and if a text talks about Judas Maccabeus as the Book of Enoch, we treat it as a book after Judas Maccabeus, and there are other criteria that corroborate this date, as the fact that no text prior to the 1st century BC makes reference to him. His literary style, his vocabulary, his grammar, and his theological profile also fit much better with other Jewish texts after the Persian period and not with older Jewish texts, and also there is no manuscript of Enoch before the Ice Age that requires us to understand that this book was prior to that. And speaking of the manuscripts we have today of this book, the oldest are fragments found among the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. These manuscripts are the oldest. Ancient dates are in Aramaic and date between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD. In addition, it is important to note that we also have some fragments dating from the medieval period related to the Book of Enoch, which are written in several languages, including Greek, Latin, and Syriac. Finally, it is worth mentioning that the most complete manuscripts available in this yearbook come from a time span from the 15th century to the 20th century and have been preserved in Ethiopia. These documents were translated into Classical Ethiopian, known as Jez. Therefore, it is common for some scholars to refer to this text as the Ethiopian Enoch, not because it originated in Ethiopia, which is not in fact the case, but rather because the only copies we know of that are considered complete versions of this text are found in the Ethiopian language. This situation is not simply a coincidence, and we can explore this more in depth in a moment. However, it is important to note that some Ethiopian communities, including the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and the community known as Beta Israel, consider the Book of Enoch to be a sacred work within their liturgy. This book, in fact, is recognized as part of the Bible by these groups, as are the books of Genesis and Revelation, which are also well known. But before we go into the details of the sacredness of the text, let us first examine the contents of the Book of Enoch in a more direct way. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, the Book of Enoch is subdivided into 5 main sections, the first part of which is often referred to as the Book of the Watchers, or, in some translations, the Book of the Watchers or the Book of the Watchers. This initial section tells an intriguing story about a group of angels, who are called Watchers in the text, who descended into the human world and interacted with mortal women, generating offspring with them. This narrative presents us with a fascinating and unconventional perspective on the interaction between the divine and the human. These children, who were born with enormous and impressive sizes, began to devour everything within their reach. This included everything from crops, including fruits and vegetables, to even animals, both those considered clean and unclean, as well as human beings and, in an even more incomprehensible act, even themselves. Meanwhile, the Watchers, these angels who descended from heaven, taught mortals various occult arts and sciences, from magic and astrology to metallurgy and the use of cosmetics. According to the text, this knowledge increased the perversity and destructive power of humans, and this, added to the issue of the cannibalistic giants that were loose on earth, ended up forcing divine intervention on the part of God. First, God sent the angel Sariel or Uriel to prepare Noah for the flood that would fall upon the earth. Then he sent the angel Raphael to fight the watchman Azazel or Azazel, who is referred to as the leader of the Watchers. Then Michael is sent to fight the semi-wing watchman, who is also known as the leader of the Watchers at other times, which may even be a clue that the version we have today of this story actually combines 2 older versions. One that had Zazel as its leader and another that had half wings, or could be 2 names for the same figure as well, but either way. One last angel, that is Gabriel, is also sent to destroy the giants, and finally comes the flood that purifies the earth, basically annihilating all the living beings that they were not in Noah's Ark. Oh, and of course, Enoch himself does not go through any of this because he is taken up by God to the heavens, where he takes a series of guided tours, so to speak, guided by angels to the secret spaces reserved for the just and the unjust, that await the last judgment. These visions of the separate places, which is what the text calls them, are very interesting because they develop in great detail the ancient Jewish imagery, at least of the Jews in the line of the author of Enoch, about the destinies of the afterlife. The idea of a space that is basically an eternal torture chamber, for example. It appears here in a way that is already very similar to what would later be the idea of hell in ancient Christianity, and the very theme of the guided tour of these spaces anticipates several other texts such as Dante's Divine Comedy and many other older ones such as the Apocalypse of Peter and Beauty is more or less that very briefly the Book of the Vigilantes. Then comes the Book of Parables. This second part of the Book of Enoch is one of the most controversial of all because it features a character that has many parallels to the Christ of the New Testament. Some scholars even argue that it is actually a Christian addition to the Book of Enoch made later, and it really is not possible to completely rule out this possibility because none of the ancient copies of the Book of Enoch preserves only the Book of Parables. Other books are also not found among them, so you will know that what we can say for sure is that this book has as its main theme the battle of good against evil and the issue of final judgment. The visions of Enoch presented here divide the world basically into 2 sides. On the one hand, the elect, the righteous, the saints and the faithful angels, and on the other side, the oppressors, the kings and powerful and the fallen angels. The evil side is led by Azazel and the good side is led by God, called there in the text the Lord of the Spirits or the Head of Days, and this good side is also led by a kind of supreme representative of God who is called the righteous, the chosen one, or even the Son of Man. This is the image to which I referred earlier, which refers in a very significant way to the description of Jesus as it is presented in the Christian texts. It combines 3 themes that are very present in the ancient Jewish imagination, which are the theme of the expected king of the lineage of David, the Messiah, the theme of the servant that appears a few times in the book of Isaiah, and the theme of the personification of wisdom, a kind of divine attribute existing even before creation that in the Greek versions was translated as logos, the word. But despite these very strong parallels with the descriptions of Jesus, the curious thing is that at the end of the book of Parables, this chosen and Son of Man is identified with Enoch himself. The text says the following: and the Head of Days, God came with Michael and Raphael and Gabriel and Phanuel and thousands and tens of thousands of countless angels, and he came to me and greeted me with his voice and said to me, You are that Son of Man who was born to righteousness, and righteousness dwells in you, and righteousness of the Head of Days will not forsake you. An ancient and very influential translation of the Book of Enoch into English even modified this passage to dissociate the image of Enoch from the Son of Man. But today this translator solution is universally rejected by experts who advocate a more direct reading of the text, according to which God's right hand in judgment is actually Enoch himself, an idea that in fact will develop in the so-called Hebrew Enoch many centuries later with the scene of the transformation of Enoch into a very high, almost divine figure called Metatron. But we can leave that for another video. Going back to the first Enoch, the Ethiopian Enoch, then we move on to the third part, which is the Book of Luminaries. The Book of Luminaries, or astronomical book, is the most different of all its main parts. Interest is in issues related to the calendar from a series of views of the functioning of the cosmos, to the right of the universe, the gates that divide, the trajectory of the stars, the winds that set these stars in motion, the action of the four beings that govern the seasons, etc. And so, the author defends the use of a solar calendar instead of the lunisolar calendar that was more traditional in ancient Judaism. This may seem a bit out of place in a religious text, but the fact is that the calendar was absolutely important for defining and observing festivals and religious rites. How to define, for example, when to celebrate Easter, sabbatical years, and Jubilee, for example. All of this depends on the calendar, and a curious thing here is that in the book of Genesis it is said that Enoch lived 365 years in a very different way than the other patriarchs, and which refers very strongly to the solar cycle of 365 days. It more or less seems that at the time Genesis was written, this relationship between Enoch and the solar calendar already existed. For some reason, by the way, the solar calendar was already used in Persia and ancient Egypt as well. Certainly, the next section that is found in the literary work entitled the Book of Enoch is known as the Book of Dreams. In this segment, narratives and visions that are presented in the form of dreams are addressed, bringing to light reflections and significant messages. In this excerpt, two distinct dreams are presented in which Enoch, a prominent character, is graced with significant and profound revelations about events that will occur in the future. These dream visions offer valuable insights and allow him to get a glimpse of what is to come, enriching the understanding about time and its consequences. The first dream mentions the occurrence of a flood, while the second presents a recapitulation of the narrative that begins with the creation of the world, advancing to the moment of the Last Judgment. This second dream, which deals with themes of a more historical nature, becomes especially fascinating in this context, because it is in it that we can identify the references to the events that stood out during the Hellenistic period, which I have already addressed at the beginning of the video. However, in order to arrive at these more complex references, it is essential to begin our analysis with the allegories that the author uses to review and reflect on the events that occurred before the flood. These allegories use animals to represent humans, stars to represent observers, descended angels, and use humans to represent faithful angels before the flood. Flood all humanity is represented as cattle. Then some stars fall and become bulls that cross with heifers on earth, and these generate camels, elephants, and donkeys. Here of course the reference is the story of the fallen angels from the Book of Watchers, where the stars are the watchers, the heifers are women, and the other animals are the giants. After that comes the flood, and after the flood a white bull appears who has 3 children, also bulls, one white, one red, and one black. The bull father dies and the offspring of the bulls multiply. But the offspring of the red bull and the black bull is formed by various impure and predatory animals, and only the offspring of the white bull remains pure, and from him comes 2 more generations of white bulls, the last generation of these bulls. The whites generate a black boar and a white sheep, and so on. In summary, the figure of the first white bull that appears after the flood is represented by Noah. Similarly, Noah's son, who is also termed as white, is the forerunner of Abraham and Isaac, 2 individuals who are also considered white bulls. From these, Jacob emerges, figuring as the white sheep in the line. On the other hand, animals that have different colorations represent the patriarchs of other nations. Thus, the red bull symbolizes Ham, while the black bull is associated with Japheth. Also, with regard to the black boar that appears at the end of the narrative, it is identified as the brother of the white sheep, named Esau. After the phase in which the patriarchs dominated, the historical references move to a period characterized by Greek domination, which began due to the expansions led by Alexander the Great and his generals. This period culminates in the significant Maccabean revolt against Hellenistic oppression, which occurred in the middle of the 2nd century BC. It is important to note that Judas Maccabeus, the renowned leader of this revolt, is symbolically depicted as a ram endowed with imposing horns. This allegorical representation harmonizes in an impressive way with the historical events that are known and documented, which raises the hypothesis, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, that the author responsible for these narratives had real knowledge about these events. Thus, he must have written about them at a later time. Although the words and visions about these events are attributed to Enoch, suggesting predictions of a distant future, This future is actually distanced only to the narrator character, Enoch, while it is recognized as past or present to the legitimate author of the work in question. However, after the period that addresses the Maccabees, we no longer find representations that align coherently with the historical events we already know. The accounts evolve at a very rapid pace towards what is considered the end of times, portraying visions of God erecting a new Jerusalem, where all peoples prostrate themselves before the Jews. In addition, there is the expectation of the resurrection of the dead for the long-awaited Last Judgment. This suggests that the author was writing his work shortly after the events related to the Maccabean revolt, and that he somehow anticipated the apocalypse while attributing these words to Enoch, who supposedly lived before the flood. Fascinatingly, he manages to get Enoch to dwell at length on future events, which actually constitute the past for himself, yet Enoch's future progresses until it approaches the author's present. However, in order for his narrative to be complete, the author feels the need to proceed to the culmination that represents the end times, which is considered both Enoch's future and his own. At this time, situations become more complex and challenging, since predictions no longer align with reality effectively, revealing themselves to be mere constructions of imagination and manifestations of hope. That hope, in turn, continues to play a key role in our lives, doesn't it? Imagination and hope can manifest themselves in any period of history. However, it is important to emphasize that the theme of the future that never materializes is something that must be discussed in more depth. This concept is typical of apocalyptic literature, a literary genre that includes works such as the Book of Enoch, as well as other well-recognized texts, such as the Book of Daniel that is part of the Hebrew Bible and the Book of Revelation itself, present in the New Testament. A clear example of this type of approach can be found in the second part of the Book of Daniel. In chapters 7 to 12, the author describes a significant number of visions that refer to the future, using symbolic images of various animals to illustrate his teachings and prophetic representations. The supposed author of the text would be Daniel, a Jew exiled in Babylon in the 6th century BC, and in his visions he sees a lion, then a bear, then a cheetah, and then a fourth beast dominating the region where it lived in the ancient Near East. The lion is Babylon, the bear is the Moss, the leopard is the Persians, and the fourth beast is the Greeks. And finally, one of the visions speaks in detail of the succession of Alexander the Great, and from his 4 generals to Antiochus and Epiphanius, who reigned in the 2nd century before Christ, and after that nothing else that the author puts matches known historical events. And just as in the Book of Enoch, the thing also advances rapidly to the end of time with a divine intervention and the resurrection of the dead. Therefore, it is more likely that the true author of the text was writing around the 1st century, and that he speaks easily of the future of Daniel from the 6th century onwards due to the fact that this was already passed on to him, which is what in academic jargon is called a vaticinium ex eventum, which is simply a prophecy in quotation marks, made after the event. But when the author starts talking about his own future, about what is really in front of him, his cart leaves the safe path of the story that ends at that point and goes away again. Freed by imagination and hope, this same approach can also be applied to the Book of Revelation, which recounts historical events in an allegorical way using also the image of animals or beasts, and which focuses mainly on the Roman emperors and then moves on to the final events, the resurrection of the dead, the judgment and the inauguration of the New Jerusalem. But then we can make specific videos detailing this discussion of each of these apocalyptic books. For now, let's go back to the Book of Enoch. Okay, only the 5th and final part is missing, which is the Epistle of Enoch. This last part of the Epistle of Enoch is written as a kind of testament and moral instruction intended for the children of Enoch, and by extension, it is also intended for future generations who will practice justice and peace. As the text says, these instructions are also given from the perspective of an imminent final judgment. The end is near. So be prepared, avoid idolatry, blood consumption, blasphemy, and the transgression of other divine laws, and if you are rich and powerful, avoid building wealth at the expense of others. Do not collect dirty money, and do not hold lavish banquets, oppressing the poor, and if you are not the oppressor, but the oppressed, have hope. Says Enoch, the unjust will be swept from the earth, and authority will be given to the righteous. The text, he says, do not fear, you who have suffered, because you will receive healing, and the light will shine on you, and the voice of serenity that you will hear from heaven is very characteristic. The prophetic discourse that promises the condemnation of the evils that plague the world and gives hope to those who suffer from these evils is a cry for justice and for better days. A very attractive message that made the Book of Enoch and several other apocalyptic books that were written in that period very popular in antiquity, especially given the context of crisis that the Jews were experiencing in that period, dominated by foreign powers infinitely more powerful than themselves, like the Greeks and then the Romans, and without any prospect of resolving the situation conventionally through politics or economics or war. For many in this context, the only hope was really the intervention of an invincible army of superhuman beings, the angels, led by none other than the creator of the universe himself. Only in this way can all visible and invisible adversaries be truly defeated and a definitive kingdom of peace established. And this and nothing less than that was what the Book of Enoch promised of good, and from this quick summary I think that several parallels between the Book of Enoch and what would later become Christianity have already become clear. The expectation of impending judgment, the call to conversion, the focus on the action of evil spirits, the saving figure of the Son of Man, and so on, right? There is a diversity of parallels that can be observed in relation to the topics addressed. It is possible to identify several intersections and similarities between these topics, which connect in different ways, revealing a rich variety of nuances and meanings. Therefore, the abundance of thematic parallels is significant and can be analyzed from different perspectives. It is no mere coincidence that throughout antiquity, the Book of Enoch has been frequently mentioned and referenced by a number of Christian authors, reflecting its impact and relevance at the time. The Epistle of Jude, as I have already said, directly quotes the Book of the Watchers, the Epistle of Barnabas, which was part of some Bibles in antiquity referring to the Book of Enoch as Scripture. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus of Lyons, and Clement of Alexandria used Enoch to talk about the fall of the angels and the origin of demons. Origin of Alexandria accepts authorship antediluvian before the flood of the Book of Enoch, but it recognizes that other church leaders disagreed with this assessment. And finally, Tertullian of Carthage says that the Book of Enoch is inspired and that the Jews do not accept this book because it speaks of Christ, and that for exactly this very reason Christians should not reject it. They should embrace it as scripture for themselves. But it is clear that if Tertullian is trying to convince other Christians not to reject the book, it is because some already rejected it, and really this attitude of greater resistance to the Book of Enoch that would end up prevailing in Christianity in the following centuries, especially after St. Augustine's criticism of this book. According to him, it could not be denied that Enoch, the seventh after Adam, had left the sacred writings because this was tested by the Apostle Jude himself in his canonical epistle. But, on the other hand, St. Augustine was strongly suspicious of the authenticity of the Book of Enoch, since he knew that the book circulating in his time was a book according to him that had not been preserved by the Jews, and that it seemed very fanciful mainly because of the story of the crossing of angels and women generating giant creatures after the 4th century. Direct references to the Book of Enoch by Christian authors become very rare indeed, but they are not entirely absent. The Byzantine monk George Syncellus, for example, in the 9th century, preserved some excerpts from the Book of the Watchers in Greek, and a Greek copy of the Book of the Watchers was found in the tomb of an Egyptian monk of the 9th century. And, of course, as I said at the beginning of the video, the Book of Enoch is still preserved today. As a whole, is considered part of the Bible by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and it is also a book considered sacred by the Beta Israel community also in Ethiopia. So on the question why the Book of Enoch was not included in the Bible, well, in fact it was included at least in a few, but really for the most part it did not go into this. Has to do mainly with the issues already anticipated there when I spoke of its reception by the early Christians. It has to do with the question of the authorship of this book having always been highly questioned. Origin. Exactly as I said, I have already reported this, and many in ancient times, they really doubted that the book had been written by Enoch. Moreover, the fact that the book does not have a long tradition within Judaism itself did not do much to establish the antiquity and, consequently, the authority of this text now independently of the Book of Enoch. In itself it is or is not in the Bible. The fact is that many of its doctrines, its statives, and its imagery, for example, about the fallen angels, about the final judgment, about the spaces reserved for the just and the unjust, for the last judgment, etc., and all this is yes. It has been very present in the history of Christianity since the New Testament, and to truly understand the apocalyptic imaginary that gave rise to Christianity, it is essential to know at least the basics about the apocalyptic literature that came before him, especially the Book of Enoch, written by two of the greatest experts in this field. Subject: the size of the set of texts that make up the Book of Anointing, the diversity of its contents, and its many implications for the study of ancient Judaism and the origins of Christianity make it possibly the most important surviving Jewish text from the Greco-Roman period. So here is the encouragement for you to delve deeper into this topic and also take a look at the specific video on Lucifer and the fall of the angels that can also help you if you're interested in this topic. So see you in the next video.